look back to those fun, playful years of childhood and ask yourself what book you most treasured. Did you answer the Ohio Almanac? Michael Wiklos does. And as a teenager, what did you do over the summer just for fun? Did you draw up a development plan for the city of Columbus? And was it a high-density, walkable plan connected by transit? Can you recall the year, month, date, and time of the grand opening of City Center? Does anybody even know what year it was?
City Center, August 1st, 1989.
August 18th, 1989. What time of day? That was 10 a.m. Sorry, Steve. You owe a bottle of bourbon. Pretty impressive. And finally, to dispel every last doubt, did you run an ad in your high school newspaper declaring, "Discover Columbus and capture the spirit"? Would you ever think of doing such a thing? Well, Michael did. So if you remember last time he was here, he had on a really cool tie that was the skyline of Columbus, like on his tie. That was really cool. Well, Michael's responsible for research, development, and implementation of effective social investments that strengthen and improve our community, and he does it with the Columbus Foundation. Michael's depth of knowledge and experience in urban planning and community development is what he does. And then prior to joining the Columbus Foundation, he served as a senior impact director for the United Way of Central Ohio, and he had positions with the Danter Company, Capital South Community Urban Redevelopment Corporation, and the City of Columbus. Michael currently serves on the Council of Historic Neighborhoods, as well as the Franklin County Community Development Advisory Board. He is also an active volunteer with the Circles Guiding Coalition, an anti-poverty solutions group, the Salvation Army, New Life United Methodist Church, where he is a youth tutor there. He holds a bachelor's degree in geography and a master's degree in city and regional planning from The Ohio State University. Help me welcome Michael Wiklos to Columbus Rotary.
Thank you and good afternoon. I had no idea he was going to go back to my childhood and expose some of my more nerdy moments as a young kid growing up in Youngstown, by the way. I was very touched by Victoria Meek's opening statement, particularly when she said about aspiring who we want to be. And I thought if there's really a theme for our city, it's about the fact that Columbus continues to aspire to be something more than it has been in the past. You know, it's very hard for us to predict the future and get it right. Rarely do we ever get the opportunity to examine trends and look at them through a wide-angle lens or something that's long-term, say 2 generations. And we examine change over time. We either see how much has changed or how little has changed. It was Chicago Tribune author Sidney Harris who said, "Our dilemma is that we hate change and love it at the same time. What we really want is for things to remain the same, but get better." Recently, the Mid-Ohio Regional Planning Commission published Insights 2050. It was an attempt to predict Columbus in 2050, or out 35 years. Do we grow the way we have in the past? Do we have a more planned future? Or do we focus on maximum infill? The 2 choices, or the several choices in that report, give you a real impact of how Columbus of the future could be. And using suburban Dublin as an example, if we grow the way we have grown the past 25 years, we'll need another 495 square miles to accommodate population growth. But if we take the extreme recommendations in that report and do maximum infill, we can add the same amount of population and only grow by 15 square miles. And that is what Dublin is doing with their Bridge Street project, trying to go high density and build a walkable community in the heart of Dublin. Well, Morpsey's report about urban planning really got the Columbus Foundation to start to think about philanthropy in our city. And what have the philanthropic needs of Columbus been looking back 35 years? And what might the philanthropic needs of this city be 35 years into the future? So we hired Dr. Bill Lafayette. Many of you may know him. He is the founder of something called Regionomics, and he published a report for us called Columbus 1980, 2015, and 2050. And he looked at everything from basic needs in education to immigration and healthcare and dozens of other issues in between. And today I want to give you a little bit of a preview of some of that data. And there are pages and pages of data tables. That is not what I brought with me today. What I brought with me today was I wanted to have a little bit of fun. And I want to take you back to Columbus of 1980 so I can remind you just how much this city has changed in 35 years. And in order to do this, I went to the Columbus Library and I got every single Columbus Monthly magazine from 1980, and I read every article from January 1st to December 31st of 1980. Because I wanted to see what was on the minds of people in Columbus. What were the advertisers advertising, and how much has changed? In 1980, well, downtown Columbus was not a very attractive place. Even if it had a few more stores than it has today, there were no trees along High Street from Nationwide to Fulton, let alone hanging baskets of flowers or power washing of the sidewalks that we all have come to expect in having a clean and tidy downtown. The Arena District was still a prison, and hopes of its redevelopment haven't even had been thought of yet. $50,000 could still buy you a house in German Village, Bexley, Grandview, and Dublin, and brand new homes were being built in Victorian Village for just $59,000. Those same houses today are starting at about $590,000. The number one selling car was the Chevy Chevette with its incredible 55 horsepower engine. Donnie and Marie were visiting with Catherine Levesque on the stage of the Palace Theater. And the new HP 85 microcomputer hit the stores. It was selling for $3,250. By the way, that would be $9,400 if you were to buy that computer today in inflation-adjusted dollars. And the VCR was just starting to be commercially sold, only to be challenged in the Supreme Court by the Motion Picture Association, claiming that the VCR would do to movie theaters, and this is a quote, what the Boston Strangler was to women left home alone. That is a quote from the Supreme Court case. Wang Computers took out a full-page ad in Columbus Monthly demonstrating the Columbus debut of a three-way electronic mail system that, based on the ad, must have been sent by lasers through space. But you had to call a phone number to get the location of where you could go to watch somebody send an email. The DeLorean, of course, made famous in the movie Back to the Future, was manufactured on Nationwide Boulevard. And Star Wars, Empire Strikes Back, was the #1 movie at the theaters. Mr. Jimmy Carter visited Columbus, and so did Ronald Reagan, and the battle for Ohio began as it continues to this day. Mr. Schwarzenegger was visiting Columbus as he was promoting himself as Mr. Olympian, having won his very first title in Columbus 10 years earlier. And Blondie had the #1 song, Call Me, which you could do on this device if, of course, Blondie wasn't using the phone. Otherwise, you would have gotten a busy signal. And there was the opening of Ohio Center, and Columbus finally had a convention center. But in the media, there were many articles that said Columbus was simply not a large enough city to actually have a convention center, and that people would not be showing up to go to conventions in Columbus. Attached to the Ohio Center was the Ohio Center Mall. It was intended to be the rebirth of downtown retail, and only 9 years later, on August 18th, 1989, at 10 a.m., Columbus City Center opened its doors. We shopped at places called Madison's, Gold Circle, Woolco, and just a few other retailers now entirely gone from the retail scene. And speaking of things that are gone, this is the list of the 15 largest private employers. You may notice that all of these private employers either no longer exist or almost have no presence in our city today. And taking with them were the 37,000 people that worked at those private sector companies. Our number one tourist destination was the French Market. And Bank One was advertising the auto bank, what was considered to be the unnecessary idea of having to do your banking 24 hours a day. But automated banking was born. The Columbus Dispatch was the first newspaper in America to do a print online version. And in the media were difficulties of Columbus schools in achieving academic success, and how the new Southside Settlement House would be offering cradle-to-grave services that would, quote, transform the lives of the working poor on Columbus's downtrodden South Side. These are the similar claims that the new Reeb Community Center now hopes to achieve. Some things don't change very much. Also in the media in May of 1980 was this cover story that was an in-depth piece on police brutality in our city. Specifically, the issue of reported abuse of African-American young males from abuse from white police officers, specifically the deaths of unarmed black youth by white officers in our city. And speaking of police, there was another young man who got in trouble in Columbus, an unknown man called Woody Harrelson, who got a little too drunk while hanging out on High Street in the University District. And there was another young man and his family named Jack who decided to move to Columbus and had big plans for the Columbus Zoo, and he grew the attendance from 300,000 to 2.4 million since he came to town. By the way, that's an 800% increase in attendance. So some things have changed, others not so much. But what does the data tell us about the past, present, and future? Well, in 1980, Columbus and the surrounding counties had just 1.3 million people. And since that time, we have grown, as you saw the headline about a week and a half ago, that Columbus now has more than 2 million people that live in our metropolitan region. And depending upon population growth, we could be somewhere between 2.4 to 2.7 million people in the next 35 years. That's up to 700,000 additional residents that we may need to accommodate in this community. What neighborhoods might they live in? What farm fields might have to be developed in order for them to move to our community? In 1980, there were 143,000 people who lived below the federal poverty line. By 2015, that number had doubled to 295,000, a 100% increase. And by 2050, while it's hard to predict the percentage of people who might be poor, the historical range in this community has been between 11 and 17%. That has always been the range for the past 50 or 35 years. So this predictive model is looking at the best case scenario and the worst case scenario. What that means is even in a best case scenario, if the percentage of people in our community living in poverty drops dramatically, we will still have more people in poverty in this community because we are a growing community. And this should make us stop and think about the decisions that we make today and how they affect economic disparity. In 1980, about 17% of the people in our region had not finished their high school education. By 2015, that number had plummeted to below 7%. And by 2050, it's expected that just 4 and 5% of people will not have completed their high school education. And while this indicator is showing significant improvement, what we know is just having completed high school does not adequately prepare most people for the difficulties of the job market today. Equally impressive in our gains, in 1980, just 20% of our region held a college degree. By 2015, we were well above state and national averages at nearly 39% of all people aged 25 and older holding at least a bachelor's degree. and depending upon a predictive model, somewhere between 40 and 55%, or nearly 700,000 people will hold a college degree in this region. Columbus has always been a destination for people for opportunity, whether that be jobs and certainly for education. And finally, looking at immigrants, foreign-born. In 1980, there were just 28,000 people who lived in this greater community that were born outside the United States. And by 2015, that number had jumped to 139,000. That, by the way, is a 500% increase, or immigrants have been growing at 10 times the rate of the general population. If this rate of change continues, by 2050, we could have somewhere between 300,000 and 450,000 people living in this region who have English as a second language, who have cultural barriers, who have different religions, who look different than us today, and both everything from our nonprofit sector to our transit system needs to adequately respond to these changes. You've heard some of the data. As I said, it's hard to predict the future and get it right. We can see this 1962 rendering of what they thought downtown Columbus was going to look like in 1992. But as we celebrate Columbus's growth and have that aspiration that we will continue to be something more than we have been in the past, I want you to think about our future decisions and the implications of our collective work. Can we reflect on Harvard University's discovery about the Columbus Way when they said, of all the cities they have studied across the country, Columbus's unique quality is its true ability to collaborate across political parties, something that I think on the national level would be nice to replicate. As a community, we have choices to make. As Canadian poet Pierre de Sico said, in the future, all cities will be distinguished by one thing, the nature of their enthusiasm. And I hope that we never lose our enthusiasm and our spirit for Columbus. Thank you.
Time for questions and answers. Q&A?
Yes, sir.
Were there any predictions made in 1980 about 2015?
You know, I went back and looked at different reports, both at the Columbus Foundation, things at United Way, and generally speaking, most of those reports were looking at shorter-term data trends, usually about a 10-year increment, because that's, of course, when census data was collected. As time has gone on between 1980 and today, the U.S. Census Bureau does do their 3-year American Community Survey estimates, so we actually get more recent and more regular data sets, but it was far harder to do some of those predictions back then. So in all the research that I did, I never found any real reports that were based in 1980 that were looking at actual data trends, other than, say, architects and planners who were looking at, say, the way people would live and the types of homes that we would have. Certainly there's been lots of things about the fact that we would be having driverless cars by now, or that we would be living in a city made of nothing but residential high-rises. A lot of that actually did not pan out, and in fact a lot of architects' versions of the future were much more modern, and then what happened starting in the 1990s was a shift to a more nostalgic look at cities. So if you look at the Arena District, or Easton, if you will, the architectural detail in those places tries to pull people back to, say, the architecture of small-town Ohio, as opposed to going in a more modern direction. Because I think in many ways, the cultural psychology of our community is that we feel really good about the past, so we want to bring those, and that was that opening quote, we want to bring the good things from the past forward, but we certainly want to have the equality and the opportunity that we offer today for people of color and LGBT populations and women and all other folks who certainly have a much better life in 2015 than they would have had in 1980. So, yes, sir.
How about predictions versus reality in respect to mass transit?
The question is predictions versus the reality of mass transit. So this is something that is not my professional expertise, but I certainly have an opinion on the topic. It is certainly one issue that this city has struggled with for several decades. Columbus has yet, as a major city, and now a city of 2 million people, we are now one of the largest cities in the country that has not invested in what's called fixed guideway transportation, light rail, high-speed rail, or heavy rail, which would be more like a subway system. What you find in those cities, like Atlanta and Houston and Dallas and Phoenix and Charlotte, which have invested in that transit, what happens is the cities start to reorganize themselves around those transit corridors, just like our city has reorganized itself around 270. And I will give you a quote. When 270 opened, and by the way, the original report for 270 was in 1955. It took about 20 years before the 270 loop opened. And there were news reports on opening day for 270 that called it the freeway to nowhere. Why would we need a 55-mile loop around our city? Because when it opened, it was mainly going through cornfields, but it irrevocably reshaped the urban geography of our city. What fixed guideway transit would do for Columbus is provide that same development incentive to develop around those rail corridors, just like we develop around highway corridors. And if the predictive models prove to be true, and Columbus grows by somewhere between 400 and 700,000 people, and you look at what we have done in the last 5 years, and I'll put that in perspective. In the last 5 years, the state of Ohio grew by 75,000 people. Franklin County alone grew by 88,000 people in 5 years, right? The economic engine of Ohio is within a 20-mile radius of Broad and High. So the question becomes choices. And what choices do we want to be making in 2016 about the kind of city that we will have in 2050? Because the Charlottes, Atlantas, Houstons, Dallases, and Phoenix, which are all very modern, post-World War II, low-density, automobile-oriented cities, have all invested in that rail option, so they're giving their residents choice. And that certainly is what I believe in, is that we should be a city that offers transportation choice. And currently, we do not. Yes, in the back.
Do you have any information on demographics of employment? What has happened to manufacturing versus distribution, medical?
Yes, the question was about data about what's happening in regard to employment, specifically with manufacturing. Manufacturing is certainly way down. As you saw that list of major employers, many of those provided living wage jobs for people who had only high school educations. Columbus is producing a lot of jobs right now. In fact, the last 5 years has been the best 5 years for job creation in our region since they've been tracking the data in more than 27 years. We added about 21,000 net jobs last year, and we will add 22,000 net jobs this year, and Columbus is considered at full employment. What is interesting, when Bill Lafayette started to peel the layers of the onion off that employment discussion, what he found is in the 21 categories of jobs, Columbus was actually adding jobs in 19 of the 21 sectors. The two sectors we were not adding jobs were service and entry-level jobs. And what he found was that there are actually less entry-level jobs in Columbus today than before the recession, and entry-level jobs or transitional jobs are paying less than what they paid before the economy. Another way to sum it up, for those of us that have either a technical skill, bricklayers, electricians, contractors, or we have an educational skill because we have a college degree, this recovery has treated us very well. But for 20% of our region who don't have those technical or educational skills, they're still waiting for the recovery to reach them, which is why we are seeing something in the current economic recovery that we have never experienced before, and that is dropping unemployment, rising wages for a large portion of us, but not a reduction in the poverty rate. And that is because of fundamental structural changes in the economy that are disadvantaging those people who have either barriers, meaning they can't pass a drug test, they can't pass a literacy test, they don't have their GED or high school diploma, and we have employers out there that need workers and they simply don't have the skill set or the soft skills in order to keep the job. And what the data also suggests that for people who work a full-time job in Franklin County, meaning if you can get a job on January 1st and keep it to December 31st, the poverty rate for those individuals is just 2.5%. But for people who work part-time or part-year, and those people work part-time and part-year because they have issues around childcare, transportation, chronic disease management, the poverty rate for that group skyrockets to nearly 27%. And those are the people that have not been able to take part in this economic recovery. That data, by the way, is looking at a much shorter term set, like looking at the last 5 years. And because of that, the Columbus Foundation is now focusing on something called Opportunity Youth. That would be youth between the ages of 18 and 24 who are not either working or enrolled in education. That is the area of our community that we are now beginning to focus on. And we just raised $850,000 last month to begin grant making in that category. And that money was raised by our donors in a matter of a few weeks. So thank you for the question. Yes, sir.
Given what's going on with higher education online, have there been 2050 studies of the impacts on the higher education institutions here, OSU, CAP, Otterbein, Franklin, et cetera?
So we didn't specifically look, the question was about the impacts of higher education. Certainly one of the issues with Columbus as a highly educated metropolitan region and the data suggesting that Columbus will continue to outperform Ohio in the US with regard to college attainment, which is a good thing. What the report by Bill Lafayette also, though, acknowledged is that college is becoming increasingly very expensive, and it is saddling far too many young people with incredible debt, many of which are finishing particularly a baccalaureate degree who may not actually be able to put that four-year degree to active use, which is why I'm certainly an advocate for those things that are offered at Columbus State that provide people a 2-year vocational training, but actually provide them a job skill where they can make significant money very quickly in the economy. So the real issue will be is, one, whether or not we are producing the jobs that require that college degree, and we are making college affordable enough so it doesn't financially burden those individuals for the long term. It was not a nuance, though, that we had him do a deep dive into, but it was a significant concern that he raised in his research study. Thank you, Ephraim.
I get to Indianapolis quite a bit, and there are a lot of similarities. How does Indianapolis and Columbus, how do they stack up?
Columbus and Indianapolis are very similar in many ways. Between 2000 and 2010, Indianapolis was growing slightly faster than Columbus. They have come through the recession a little more difficultly than we have. The recession there came a little sooner. The recovery started in Indy a little later. If you look at job growth in Columbus versus Indianapolis, it has been more robust here. If you look at population growth, while Indianapolis outpaced us between 2000 and 2010, Columbus has been outpacing Indianapolis between 2010 and 2015. That is partly due to the fact that Indianapolis actually has a larger portion of their regional economy that is tied to a manufacturing base than Columbus. Indianapolis is favored by the fact that it actually has lower cost home building, so they benefit in that category. But for the most recent economic indicators, Columbus is outperforming Indianapolis just slightly. The other issue is Columbus, through an educational attainment perspective, Columbus is much better prepared to move into an information age because we have a higher level of educational attainment, and many companies come to Columbus to tap that readily available labor pool, which is not always available in Indy. Thank you for your time today.
Next week's speakers will be Ted Hines and Dan Sullivan, who will be sharing with us about the U.S. Senior Open and giving us a behind-the-scenes look at that very exciting tournament that's going to be going on at Scioto Country Club. In the meantime, have a great week. Be a Rotarian all week long.